The duty beyond the post. The dawn light was just beginning to creep over the ancient stones of Windsor Castle, casting long shadows across the cobbled streets and whispering of another day. The town was slowly stirring, reluctant to fully shake off the remnants of the previous night's quiet. But at King Henry Gate, one figure stood resolute, perfectly poised, as he had for 15 years. James Mitchell, known among his peers as the most disciplined of the Royal Guard, maintained his stoic stance. His spotless uniform and impeccable posture had become a familiar sight for locals and tourists alike. James took great pride in his work, in the quiet, dignified purpose of his role. Standing guard was more than a job. It was a calling, a commitment to upholding the legacy and traditions that Windsor Castle embodied. He was the silent protector, an unyielding presence that symbolized the stability of the crown. But on this misty morning, something unexpected and unsettling would challenge everything he had come to believe about duty and honor. As the morning fog began to lift, revealing the cobblestones beneath with a silvery sheen, James noticed a small figure weaving through the still empty market stalls across the square. His sharp eyes caught sight of a young girl, no older than 8, dressed in wrinkled green pajamas. Her dark curls framed a face marked by dirt and a hint of something more troubling, a mixture of fear and determination. She moved with a surprising agility for someone her age, her steps quick and cautious, as if she were on a mission that required both urgency and stealth. James watched as she darted to a stall, snatched a scone from an unattended tray, and slipped into the shadows of an alley before the vendor even realized what had happened. For a brief moment, James considered intervening, but protocol dictated otherwise. His duty was to the castle and the crown, not to the bustling town around him. Yet, as he resumed his stoic stance, he couldn't shake the image of the girl in her disheveled pajamas, her small face marked by desperation. The memory lingered, gnawing at the edges of his disciplined mind. It was rare for anything to distract him during his shift, but there was something about the girl's furtive manner and ragged appearance that unsettled him in a way he couldn't easily dismiss. As the sun rose higher, Windsor began to come alive. Merchants filled the square, setting up their stalls, the aroma of freshly baked bread mingling with the damp earth and morning dew. The peaceful bustle was occasionally interrupted by the laughter of children running past, their carefree energy a stark contrast to James's rigid posture. He forced himself to refocus, scanning the area with practiced vigilance. But as the minutes turned into hours, his thoughts drifted back to the girl. Who was she? Why was she alone, wandering the streets in pajamas at dawn? And where were her parents? The question nagged at him, growing into a quiet concern that felt out of place amidst the solemnity of his post. He had always prided himself on his ability to compartmentalize, to set aside personal thoughts and emotions in service of his duty. But the image of the little girl in green pajamas, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination, had pierced through his defenses. It was late morning when the quiet near King Henry Gate was disturbed by the soft patter of small feet on cobblestones. James's gaze shifted, his disciplined stoicism slipping just slightly as he recognized the figure approaching him. It was the same girl from earlier, still dressed in her pajamas, her dark curls wild and tangled. This time, however, she seemed less cautious, her movements slower, more deliberate, as though she had finally gathered enough courage to face him directly. The girl stopped a few paces away from him, her small frame trembling, though whether from the cold or something else, he couldn't tell. She looked up at him, her gaze intense and filled with a mixture of hope and desperation that made his heart ache in a way he hadn't felt in years. "Are you a hero?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the gentle morning breeze. The question took him by surprise. In all his years of service, no one had ever called him a hero. He was simply a guard, a protector of traditions and symbols, a silent sentinel bound by duty. And yet, standing there, looking down at the fragile figure before him, he felt the weight of her words settle on his shoulders in a way that his uniform and training never had. Protocol dictated that he remain silent, that he neither acknowledge nor respond to any interaction unless it was directly related to his duties. But this was different. The intensity in her gaze, the vulnerability in her voice, it stirred something deep within him, something he had long buried beneath years of discipline. He remained still, torn between his duty and an inexplicable urge to break protocol, to reach out and ask her what had driven her to seek help from a silent royal guard. For a moment, he held her gaze, his usual impassive expression softening just slightly. But his training held firm, and he stayed silent. The girl's face fell as the hope in her eyes began to fade. She took a step back, her shoulders slumping as though an invisible weight had settled upon them. It was a heartbreaking transformation, and James felt a pang of regret, even as he reminded himself of the rules he was bound to uphold. Without another word, the girl turned and walked back toward the alley from which she had come, her small figure disappearing into the shadows. James watched her go, his heart heavy with a sense of helplessness he hadn't felt in years. She had come to him, looking for a hero, and he had failed her. The thought gnawed at him, leaving a hollow ache in his chest. As the day wore on, James found himself distracted, his mind returning again and again to the girl's desperate plea. The image of her retreating figure haunted him, her words echoing in his mind. He had always believed that his duty was clear-cut, that his role as a royal guard required him to maintain order and protect the castle, no matter what. But now, for the first time, he questioned whether his duty extended beyond the walls of Windsor, beyond the rigid protocols he had followed without question. Was it possible that his true calling lay not just in standing guard, but in standing up for those who couldn't protect themselves? The shift change was approaching, and James knew he would soon be free from his post, at least for a short break. He made a decision then, one that felt both reckless and right. As soon as his relief arrived, he would search for the girl. He didn't know where she had gone, but he was determined to find her, to offer her the help he had denied earlier. When his relief finally arrived, James wasted no time. He walked briskly toward the market square, his mind racing with questions and a growing sense of urgency. The vendors were now in full swing, their voices loud and cheerful as they haggled with customers. James scanned the crowd, looking for any sign of the girl, his eyes darting from stall to stall. He retraced his steps to the baker's stall, where he had first seen her steal the scone that morning. The vendor, a stout man with flour dusting his apron, looked up as James approached, a curious expression on his face. "Excuse me," James said, his voice formal. "Did you happen to see a young girl here earlier this morning? Dark hair, green pajamas." The baker's brow furrowed as he thought for a moment. I did see a little one like that," he replied. "Took a scone, she did. Thought I saw her ducking into that alley over there." He gestured toward a narrow passageway between two buildings, shadowed and uninviting. "Thank you," James said, nodding to the baker before making his way toward the alley. As he entered the narrow space, the light dimmed and the bustling sounds of the market faded, replaced by a quiet stillness. The air was thick with the faint smell of dampness and decay, a stark contrast to the lively energy of the square. He moved carefully, his footsteps echoing softly against the stone walls. As he ventured deeper, a flicker of movement caught his eye. There, crouched behind a pile of crates, was the girl. She held a worn teddy bear tightly against her chest, her eyes wide with fear and relief as she saw him approach. "You came back," she whispered, her voice barely audible. James knelt down, his usual stoic expression softening as he looked into her tear-streaked face. "I'm here now," he said quietly. "I'm here to help. Tell me what's wrong." The girl hesitated, glancing down at the teddy bear in her arms. He noticed then that the bear's fur was stained with dark marks, blood. His heart pounded as he realized the gravity of the situation. "It's not mine," she whispered, her voice trembling. It's my brother's. Please, sir, you have to help him. He's hurt, and they wouldn't listen to me. But you look like a hero." Her words shattered the last remnants of his discipline. In that moment, James knew he couldn't simply stand by, bound by rules and protocols. This wasn't about duty to the crown or loyalty to his post. This was about a child in need, a family in danger. His purpose, he realized, was not only to guard but to protect, to stand up for those who needed him. He nodded, his gaze steady and filled with a determination that surprised even himself. "Show me where he is," he said, his voice firm. The girl's face lit up with a glimmer of hope as she reached out, taking his hand in her small, trembling fingers. Together, they moved through the shadows, stepping beyond the boundaries of protocol and duty, into a world where true heroism was measured not by medals or titles, but by the lives one chose to protect. Into the shadows. As they moved through the winding alleys of Windsor, James couldn't shake the realization that he was breaking every protocol he'd followed so faithfully for the past 15 years. He had left his post, disregarded orders, and abandoned his duty to the crown, all for a little girl in green pajamas clutching a blood-stained teddy bear. But with each step, with every uncertain look that Tamara cast back at him, he knew he couldn't turn back. The sense of duty that had held him to his post all these years now anchored him to this girl's side. Tamara led him down a narrow street that twisted and turned, the buildings leaning over them as if to hide them from the world. The cobbled path was uneven, and the air grew colder and heavier with each step. The familiar, structured environment of Windsor Castle had given way to a part of the town James rarely ventured into, a hidden world tucked away from the polished walls of royalty and grandeur. "What happened to your brother?" he asked softly as they walked, his voice low and steady, trying not to scare her. He could feel her tiny fingers gripping his hand tightly, her small form shivering despite his attempts to keep her calm. He got hurt," Tamara whispered, her voice wavering as she struggled to find the right words. We don't have anyone else to help us. I tried to go to the police, but they didn't believe me. They told me to go home, but..." Her voice broke off, and James could see the tears welling up in her eyes. She bit her lip, fighting to hold them back, her small face set with a bravery beyond her years. James felt a surge of anger, not at her, but at the system that had failed her, at the indifference of those who had dismissed her. How many times had he watched as people in need were ignored because they didn't fit neatly into the roles society expected them to play? How often had he convinced himself that it wasn't his job, that someone else would step in? But here was a child, all alone, with only her courage and desperation to guide her. "Where is he?" James pressed gently. "Take me to him. I'll help him, I promise." Tamara nodded, her face lighting up with a glimmer of hope as she guided him around another corner, down a desolate alley that led to a rundown building. Its facade was crumbling, paint peeling from the walls, and a broken sign dangled precariously above the door, announcing in faded letters, "Street Mary's Shelter." The building looked abandoned, forgotten by time, and everyone who had ever passed by. James realized that it was the kind of place people went to disappear, to be unseen, even in a small town like Windsor. "In here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She pushed the door open, revealing a dimly lit interior. The smell of mildew and decay filled the air, and the flickering light bulbs cast eerie shadows across the walls. James felt a chill settle over him, but he kept his face calm, knowing Tamara needed his reassurance now more than ever. They walked down a narrow hallway lined with faded posters and cracked walls, the silence broken only by the creak of their footsteps. Tamara's grip on his hand tightened, and James could feel the urgency in her steps as she pulled him along. "He's in there," she said, stopping in front of a small, cluttered room near the end of the hall. The door was slightly ajar, and James could see a figure lying on a makeshift bed, a thin blanket pulled up to his chin. Tamara let go of his hand and rushed to her brother's side, gently brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. James followed her into the room, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. The boy looked younger than Tamara, maybe 5 or 6, with the same dark curls and the same brave determination shining in his fevered eyes. His face was pale, his skin clammy, and his tiny frame seemed almost swallowed by the thin blanket. As James knelt beside him, he noticed a ragged bandage wrapped around the boy's leg, stained with dried blood. "What happened to him?" James asked, his voice soft as he examined the makeshift bandage. His instincts told him the wound was infected. He had seen enough injuries in his time to recognize the signs. The boy needed medical attention, and he needed it soon. He hurt his leg," Tamara replied, her voice quivering as she held her brother's hand. "We were running from some men. They were looking for us. I don't know why, but we had to hide here. It was the only place we could find." James's mind raced as he processed her words. Who were these men, and why were they after two young children? He felt a surge of protectiveness, a fierce determination to shield them from whatever threat lurked outside. This wasn't just a case of a little girl needing help. There was something deeper, something more sinister at play. "Tamara," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "do you know who these men were? Why they were looking for you?" She shook her head, her eyes filled with fear and uncertainty. I don't know. They came to our house one night, and they took our mom. I tried to stop them, but they were too strong. They told me and Ollie to stay quiet, but I couldn't. I had to get him out. I had to protect him." James felt his heart break at her words. This young girl had taken on the role of protector, had risked everything to keep her little brother safe. And now, here they were, alone and frightened, with no one to turn to. He knew he had to act fast. Time was running out, and Ollie's condition was deteriorating. "All right," he said, his voice steady. "I'm going to help you both. But I need you to trust me, okay?" Tamara nodded, her eyes wide and filled with hope as she looked up at him. "What are you going to do?" James took a deep breath, his mind racing as he formulated a plan. His duty, his loyalty to the crown, everything he had trained for, it all faded into the background. At this moment, his only priority was getting these children to safety. "First, we're going to get Ollie some medical help. Then we'll find out what's going on. You're not alone anymore. I'm here, and I'm not going to let anything happen to you." Tamara's shoulders relaxed, and for the first time, she looked as if a weight had been lifted from her. She clung to his promise as if it were a lifeline, and James felt a renewed sense of purpose as he prepared to take on whatever danger lay ahead. With Tamara's help, he lifted Ollie gently, cradling the boy's fragile body in his arms. He could feel the fever radiating from him, the way his small form shivered even through the thin blanket. They moved as quickly as they could through the shelter's dark hallways, James guiding Tamara with calm authority as they made their way to the exit. The morning sun had risen higher in the sky by the time they stepped back onto the streets of Windsor. The bustling sounds of the town seemed to wash over them, a reminder that life was moving on even as Tamara and Ollie's world was falling apart. James knew he had to keep a low profile. As a royal guard, he would be recognized if he drew too much attention, and the last thing he needed was for someone to report his absence back to his superiors. He led them to a discreet side street, keeping his eyes peeled for any sign of the men Tamara had mentioned. His mind raced, piecing together the fragments of information he had gathered. Who were these men? And why would they take the children's mother? As they walked, Tamara looked up at him with wide, trusting eyes. "Thank you, sir," she whispered. "I didn't think anyone would believe me." James felt a lump form in his throat. He had always prided himself on his discipline, on his commitment to his role. But at this moment, he realized that true duty went beyond rules and protocol. His real duty was to protect those who couldn't protect themselves, to stand up for what was right, even if it meant stepping away from his post. They reached a small clinic tucked away from the main streets, a modest building with a worn sign that read Dr. Whitaker's Clinic. James knew of Dr. Whitaker, a retired physician who still served the town's most vulnerable residents, those who couldn't afford the services of the larger hospitals. It was their best chance at getting Ollie the help he desperately needed. As they stepped inside, a nurse at the reception desk looked up, her eyes widening as she took in the sight of James in his Royal Guard uniform, carrying a young boy in his arms. "Please," James said, his voice steady but urgent. "This boy needs help. He's injured, and he has a fever." The nurse nodded, springing into action as she led them to an examination room. Dr. Whittaker appeared moments later, his white hair and gentle demeanor a reassuring presence as he assessed Ollie's condition. As Dr. Whittaker worked, Tamara clung to James's side, her hand gripping his sleeve as if afraid he might vanish at any moment. He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, giving her a gentle squeeze. He was here, and he wasn't going anywhere. After what felt like an eternity, Dr. Whittaker looked up, his expression grave but calm. "The boy has an infection in his leg. It's serious, but treatable. He'll need antibiotics, rest, and a clean environment." James felt a surge of relief, tempered by the realization that their journey was far from over. The children needed more than just medical care. They needed protection, a safe place where they could begin to heal. As Dr. Whittaker prepared the medication, James looked down at Tamara, a new resolve hardening in his gaze. He knew he was venturing into uncharted territory, stepping far beyond the boundaries of his duties. But he was committed. He had taken these children under his wing, and he would see this through to the end. Outside the clinic, the town continued its bustling routine, oblivious to the small act of heroism unfolding within its walls. And as James held Tamara's hand, he understood that his journey with these children had only just begun. The road ahead was uncertain, fraught with challenges and risks, but he was ready. For the first time in years, he felt that he was exactly where he needed to be. A hero's burden. The quiet ticking of the clock filled the small, dimly lit examination room as Dr. Whittaker worked carefully, cleaning Ollie's wound and administering the first dose of antibiotics. Tamara sat beside her brother, holding his hand tightly, her gaze unwavering, as she watched the doctor's every move. James stood near the door, his arms crossed over his chest, his face a mask of calm determination, though his heart was pounding with the weight of everything that had happened in just a few hours. Dr. Whittaker finally looked up, wiping his hands on a cloth, his eyes meeting James with a mixture of compassion and gravity. "The infection is serious, but we've caught it in time," he said in a low voice, keeping his tone gentle for the children's sake. "He'll need to stay here for a day or two, at least, so we can monitor his progress. I can waive the fees. These children clearly don't have anyone looking out for them right now." James nodded, a sense of relief washing over him. "Thank you, Doctor. I didn't know where else to take them." Dr. Whittaker gave him a small, understanding smile. "You did the right thing. But if you're planning to keep helping them, you need to know what you're up against." He glanced at Tamara, who was too focused on her brother to hear their conversation. "These children look like they've been through something terrible. If they were running from someone dangerous, you're putting yourself at risk by getting involved." James met the doctor's gaze, his expression hardening. He knew the risks, knew that his actions would likely have consequences, but looking at Tamara, her fragile form clinging to her brother's side, he knew he couldn't walk away. "They don't have anyone else," he replied simply. "I'll take care of them, no matter what." Dr. Whittaker nodded, his face etched with respect and caution. "Very well. But be careful, James. Windsor isn't as safe as it seems, especially if there are people willing to hurt children." As Dr. Whittaker left the room, James sat down on a nearby stool, feeling the weight of his decision settle heavily on his shoulders. He'd never expected to find himself in this situation, risking his career, his safety, and everything he had worked for, all for two children he had met only hours before. But in a strange way, he felt more purpose than he ever had standing at his post. This was real. This was tangible. And for once, he wasn't just protecting symbols and traditions. He was protecting lives. "Sir." Tamara's soft voice pulled him from his thoughts. She looked up at him with wide, uncertain eyes, her hand still clutching her brother's. "Will Ollie be okay?" James offered her a reassuring smile, though he felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. "Yes, Tamara. The doctor said he'll be fine with some rest and medicine. Your brother's strong, just like you." Tamara's shoulders relaxed, and she managed a small, grateful smile. "Thank you, sir, for believing me. No one else did." James felt a pang of anger at the thought of anyone turning this brave, vulnerable child away. "You don't have to call me sir, you know. My name is James." Tamara's eyes widened, as if surprised that someone like him would want to be called anything other than sir. But after a moment, she nodded. "Thank you, James." As the minutes passed, James watched over the siblings, marveling at the strength and resilience they displayed despite their young age. Ollie, though pale and weak, managed a small smile for his sister, his eyes lighting up whenever she spoke to him. Tamara, in turn, fussed over him with the care and protectiveness of someone much older, her face etched with a maturity that seemed unnatural for a child. Finally, after ensuring that Ollie was comfortable, James stood, knowing he couldn't stay in the clinic forever. He had left his post without permission, and if his superiors discovered his absence, there would be consequences. But as he prepared to leave, he realized he couldn't just walk away, not without ensuring that Tamara and Ollie were safe. "Tamara," he said gently, crouching down to meet her gaze, "I have to go back to the castle for a little while. But I'll come back, I promise. You and Ollie will be safe here with Dr. Whitaker." A flicker of fear crossed her face, and she reached out, grabbing his hand as if afraid he might vanish if she let go. You won't leave us, will you?" James felt a lump form in his throat as he saw the desperation in her eyes. He placed a reassuring hand over hers, giving it a gentle squeeze. "I promise, Tamara. I'll be back as soon as I can. I just need to make sure no one realizes I'm gone." Tamara nodded slowly, releasing his hand, though the worry in her eyes remained. James forced himself to stand, offering her a final nod before stepping out of the room and into the hallway. As he made his way out of the clinic, he glanced back one last time, committing their faces to memory. He had to get back to his post, but he knew that his thoughts and his heart would remain with them. The walk back to Windsor Castle was filled with a mixture of dread and determination. James knew that he was venturing into dangerous territory, both personally and professionally. He had broken protocol, left his post without permission, and involved himself in a situation far beyond the scope of his duty. If his superiors found out, it could mean the end of his career, the loss of everything he had built over the years. But as he approached King Henry Gate, the weight of the consequences didn't deter him. He had made a promise, and he intended to keep it. He would return to Tamara and Ollie, no matter what it took. When he arrived back at his post, he found his friend and fellow guard, Oscar, waiting for him, leaning against the stone wall with a knowing look in his eyes. Oscar was a few years older than James, with a gruff demeanor that hid a heart of gold. They had served together for years, sharing countless shifts and secrets, and Oscar had always been someone James could trust. "You were gone a long time, mate," Oscar said, raising an eyebrow as James took his place beside him. "Thought you might have taken a stroll around the entire castle." James forced a casual smile, though he could feel the tension simmering beneath the surface. Had to take care of something. Didn't mean to be gone so long. Oscar studied him for a moment, his gaze sharp and perceptive. "You're not one to break protocol, James. Something tells me this wasn't just a quick errand." James hesitated, wondering how much he should reveal. But he knew Oscar well enough to trust him, to believe that he would understand the gravity of the situation. Taking a deep breath, he leaned in, lowering his voice. "There's a situation," he began, choosing his words carefully. "A couple of kids in trouble. They needed help, and I couldn't just leave them." Oscar's eyes widened slightly, a mixture of surprise and concern flashing across his face. Kids, what kind of trouble? James explained everything in a quiet voice. The encounter with Tamara, her desperate plea for help, the blood-stained teddy bear, and the rundown shelter where she and her brother had been hiding. He kept his tone low, his words guarded, but he didn't hold back the urgency he felt, the instinctive need to protect these children. When he finished, Oscar let out a low whistle, shaking his head in disbelief. "Blimey, James, you really went out on a limb for them." "I had to," James replied, his voice firm. "They were alone, scared. No one else would help them." Oscar's expression softened, and he placed a reassuring hand on James's shoulder. "You did the right thing, mate, but you know the higher-ups won't see it that way. If they find out." "I know," James said, nodding grimly. "But I can't just abandon them. I promised Tamara I'd help." Oscar was silent for a moment, his gaze distant as he weighed the risks. Then he nodded, his jaw set with determination. "All right, I'll cover for you. If anyone asks, you were here the whole time. Just be careful, yeah." James felt a surge of gratitude, a weight lifting off his shoulders as he realized he wouldn't have to face this alone. "Thank you, Oscar. I won't forget this." With a final nod, Oscar returned to his post, standing watch with the same stoic determination that had become second nature to them both. James felt a sense of relief, tempered by the knowledge that his journey was far from over. He still had to return to Tamara and Ollie, still had to uncover the truth about the mysterious men who had taken their mother. Hours passed, the sun beginning its descent, casting long shadows across the cobblestones of Windsor. James's shift was finally coming to an end, and he could feel the anticipation building within him. He had been waiting for this moment, counting down the minutes until he could leave and return to the children who had captured his heart. As the last rays of sunlight faded, James quietly slipped away from his post, making his way back through the winding streets of the town. His heart pounded with a mixture of urgency and resolve, his mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. When he arrived at the clinic, he found Dr. Whittaker waiting for him in the hallway, his expression grave. "James," the doctor said in a hushed tone, glancing over his shoulder to ensure no one else was listening. "There's something you should know." James felt a chill run down his spine. "What is it?" Dr. Whittaker hesitated, then gestured for James to follow him into a small office at the back of the clinic. Once inside, he closed the door, his face lined with concern. "I did some checking. Those children, they're not just any kids. Their mother was involved in something dangerous, something that could put them, and anyone who helps them, in serious danger." James's jaw tightened as he absorbed the doctor's words. "What do you mean? What was she involved in?" Dr. Whittaker shook his head. "I don't have all the details, but from what I've heard, she crossed paths with a group that doesn't take kindly to interference. They're powerful, connected, and they won't stop until they get what they want." A sense of dread settled over James, but it was quickly replaced by a fierce resolve. "I don't care who they are. I'm not leaving those kids." Dr. Whittaker sighed, a look of admiration mixed with worry in his eyes. "I figured you'd say that. Just be careful, James. You're a good man, but these people, they don't play by the same rules." James nodded, his expression steely. He had already made his choice, and no amount of warning would deter him. "Thank you, Doctor, for everything." Dr. Whittaker nodded, placing a hand on James's shoulder. "Good luck, James, and remember, you're not alone." With that, James left the clinic, his mind focused and his purpose clear. He was heading into a storm, but he wouldn't let fear sway him. The stakes were higher than he had anticipated, but he was ready to face whatever came his way. As he made his way back to the rundown building where Tamara and Ollie had taken refuge, James felt a calmness settle over him. For the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to be a hero, not because of duty, not because of honor, but because of the choice to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. In the quiet shadows of Windsor's forgotten streets, James prepared to face an enemy he couldn't see, guided only by the trust of two frightened children who had placed their lives in his hands. Into the depths. Nightfall cast a shroud over Windsor, transforming the town's familiar streets into a network of shadows and hidden dangers. James moved quickly, his footsteps echoing in the quiet, deserted alleyways. He kept his senses sharp, acutely aware that he was no longer just a royal guard on a clandestine mission to protect two children. He was now a man marked by his choice to stand against something darker and more dangerous than he'd ever faced. As he approached the abandoned shelter where Tamara and Ollie were staying, James couldn't shake Dr. Whitaker's warning. The group that had taken their mother, the people who don't play by the same rules, we're likely dangerous enough to send a chill down even the toughest of spines. And here he was, an ordinary guard, willingly stepping into their crosshairs for two children he barely knew. But he couldn't turn back. Not now. The dilapidated building loomed before him, its broken windows and peeling paint a stark contrast to the grandeur of Windsor Castle where he had spent so many years. He pushed open the door, which creaked loudly in the silence of the night, and made his way inside, navigating the dark corridors with caution. Every step felt heavy, burdened by the knowledge that he was crossing an invisible line, stepping into a world far removed from his structured, disciplined life. As he neared the room where he had left Tamara and Ollie, he heard muffled voices. He tensed, his instincts kicking in as he moved silently, pressing himself against the wall just outside the doorway. The voices were low, urgent, and unfamiliar. A man and a woman, their tones tinged with anger and frustration. James's heart pounded as he strained to make out their words. "Can't believe they got away," the man was saying, his voice rough and impatient. "We should have grabbed them when we had the chance. This whole thing is spiraling out of control." The woman responded in a hushed but equally tense voice. "You think I don't know that? We were supposed to be gone by now. If those kids talk, if they tell anyone about what they saw." James felt a surge of anger and protectiveness. Whoever these people were, they were clearly connected to the danger surrounding Tamara and Ollie. They had to be the ones responsible for the blood-stained teddy bear, the fear in Tamara's eyes, the injuries that had left Ollie bedridden. And now they were here, likely looking for the children, perhaps even planning to silence them. He didn't think, he acted. Stepping into the doorway, James squared his shoulders and fixed his gaze on the two figures. They froze, their eyes widening in surprise as they took in the sight of a royal guard standing in their path, his posture unyielding and his expression as cold as steel. "Step away from the children," James commanded, his voice low but deadly. "Whatever you're here for, it ends now." The man recovered first, a sneer twisting his face. "Who the hell are you?" he spat, eyeing James's uniform with a mixture of disdain and amusement. "Some castle stooge come to play hero." James didn't flinch. "I'm someone who doesn't take kindly to threats against children," he replied, his tone unwavering. "Now leave, before this gets ugly." The woman, a slender figure with sharp features, stepped forward, her eyes narrowing as she assessed him. "Do you have any idea what you're getting yourself into? These kids, they're not your concern. You're meddling in things you can't possibly understand." James felt a surge of indignation. "I understand enough to know that innocent lives are at risk, and I won't stand by while you threaten them." The man glanced at the woman, a silent exchange passing between them. Then, with a casual shrug, he reached into his coat, pulling out a sleek, black handgun. The sight of the weapon sent a jolt through James, but he held his ground, refusing to back down even as the cold glint of metal glared back at him. "Listen, hero," the man sneered, leveling the gun at James. "This doesn't have to get messy. Walk away, and we'll pretend we never saw you. But if you get in our way—" He didn't finish the sentence, but the threat hung heavy in the air, a silent ultimatum that dared James to defy it. For a brief moment, Doubt flickered in James's mind. He was unarmed, outnumbered, and standing in the path of two people who clearly wouldn't hesitate to use violence to achieve their goals. But as his gaze shifted to Tamara and Ollie, huddled together on the makeshift bed, their eyes wide with terror, he felt a surge of resolve that overpowered his fear. He took a step forward, his gaze never leaving the man's. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," he said, his voice cold and calm. "I've faced worse threats than the likes of you. Put the gun down, or I'll make sure you regret it." The woman's eyes narrowed, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. She seemed to sense the steel in his words, the unwavering conviction that marked him as a man who wouldn't be easily swayed. She nudged the man, her tone sharp. "Let's go. We don't need this kind of attention." The man hesitated, his gaze flicking between James and the children. For a tense moment, it seemed as though he might defy her, but finally he lowered the gun, his sneer returning. "Fine. Have it your way, hero. But don't think this is over." Without another word, he turned and strode past James, the woman following close behind. They moved down the hallway, their footsteps fading into the distance until the silence of the abandoned shelter settled once more. James let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his body relaxing as the adrenaline began to ebb. He turned to Tamara and Ollie, who were staring at him with a mixture of awe and relief. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice gentle as he approached them. Tamara nodded, though she was visibly shaken. Thank you, James," she whispered, her voice trembling. I thought they were going to." James knelt down beside her, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "They're gone now. You're safe." Ollie, still pale and weak, managed a small, grateful smile. You're really brave, Mr. James." James felt a pang of emotion at the boy's words. He hadn't felt brave. Not truly. He had simply acted out of necessity, out of a duty that went beyond titles and roles. In that moment, he knew he would do whatever it took to protect these children, even if it meant facing more dangerous adversaries in the future. But he also knew he couldn't do it alone. "Listen," he said, his tone serious as he looked at Tamara. "We need to get you both somewhere safer. This shelter isn't enough to protect you from people like them. Do you have any other family? Anyone who can take you in?" Tamara shook her head, her eyes filling with sadness. "It's just me and Ollie now. Since they took Mom." James felt a pang of sympathy, but he forced himself to focus. "Then we'll have to figure something out. I know a few people who might be able to help, but it'll mean going back into town, keeping a low profile. Do you understand?" Tamara nodded, a flicker of determination returning to her eyes. "I understand, James. We'll do whatever you say." He gave her a reassuring smile before glancing around the small, dingy room. It was clear they couldn't stay here, not with people actively searching for them. He needed a plan, somewhere secure where they could regroup and figure out the next steps. As they prepared to leave, James heard a faint sound outside. A car engine idling, its rumble barely audible over the quiet of the night. His instincts flared, and he motioned for the children to stay silent. Creeping to the window, he peered out, his heart pounding. A sleek black sedan was parked across the street, its headlights off but its engine still running. Inside, he could make out the shadowy figures of two people, the man and the woman he had just confronted. They hadn't left. They were waiting, watching, hoping he'd lead the children out into the open. James's mind raced as he considered his options. They were trapped, their only escape route monitored by dangerous people who would likely stop at nothing to get what they wanted. He knew he couldn't confront them again, not without backup, not without a plan. Then an idea struck him. It was risky, and it would require the help of someone he trusted implicitly. He pulled out his phone, quickly dialing Oscar's number. His friend answered on the second ring, his voice tinged with concern. "James, what's going on? You vanished from the post, and now I'm hearing rumors." "Oscar," James interrupted, his voice urgent. "I need your help. There's no time to explain, but I need you to bring a car to Street Mary's shelter. I have 2 kids with me, and we're in trouble." Oscar was silent for a moment, processing the weight of James's words. Finally, he responded, his tone firm. "I'll be there in 10 minutes. Just stay safe, mate." James ended the call, his heart pounding with a mixture of relief and tension. He turned to Tamara and Ollie, who were watching him with wide, trusting eyes. "Help is on the way. We just need to hold tight until my friend arrives." They huddled together in the dimly lit room, the tension thickening with each passing minute. Outside, the black sit-in remained, its silent occupants watching, waiting. James kept a protective arm around the children, his gaze never leaving the door. Finally, the faint sound of another engine reached his ears, and he let out a breath of relief as he recognized Oscar's car pulling up to the shelter. The headlights flashed twice, a signal they had used in the past, and James knew it was time to move. "Stay close to me," he whispered to Tamara and Ollie. "And don't make a sound." He led them through the building's back exit, using the shadows to conceal their movements. They slipped out into the alley, moving swiftly and silently toward Oscar's waiting car. The black sedan remained parked across the street, its occupants seemingly oblivious to their escape. When they reached Oscar's car, James ushered the children inside, quickly sliding into the front passenger seat. Oscar cast a worried glance in the rearview mirror as he pulled away, leaving the shelter and the danger behind. As they sped through the darkened streets, Oscar finally spoke, his voice laced with concern. "James, what have you gotten yourself into?" James looked at his friend, his gaze steady but filled with a determination that Oscar had rarely seen before. "I don't know, Oscar, but whatever it is, I'm not backing down. These kids, they need me, and I'm going to protect them, no matter what." Oscar nodded, a flicker of respect in his eyes. "Then we'll figure it out together, mate, whatever it takes." As they drove into the night, James felt a surge of resolve. The journey was far from over, and the danger was only beginning. But he knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't rest until Tamara and Ollie were safe, no matter the cost. In that moment, he embraced the burden of his choice, accepting that he was no longer just a royal guard. He was a protector, a hero, and he would face whatever challenges lay ahead, because some things were worth breaking the rules for. Crossing lines and facing shadows. The night air was cool as Oscar's car sped down the winding roads of Windsor, leaving the shelter far behind. Tamara and Ollie huddled together in the back seat, their eyes wide and tired, clinging to each other as though the touch alone would keep them safe. James sat in the front passenger seat, casting wary glances over his shoulder, watching for any signs of the black sedan in pursuit. His pulse raced as he considered the implications of his actions, the people he was up against, the boundaries he was crossing. Oscar drove with a focused intensity, his usual light-hearted demeanor replaced by a steely determination. The streets of Windsor were quiet at this hour, the usual hustle and bustle of tourists and townsfolk replaced by an eerie calm. The silence in the car was thick, charged with the weight of everything that had happened. After a few minutes, Oscar broke the silence, his voice low and steady. "James, where are we going? And don't give me the 'I don't know' answer. We're way past that now." James exhaled, rubbing his temples as he tried to piece together a plan. "I don't have all the answers, Oscar, but I know these kids are in real danger. Their mother was taken by some group, and they were after the kids too. I don't know who they are or why they're targeting them, but I can't just hand them over to the authorities, not until I know they'll be safe." Oscar frowned, glancing in the rearview mirror at Tamara and Ollie, who were listening quietly, their faces pale and anxious. "So, what are you suggesting? You can't protect them alone, James. You've got no resources, no allies outside of me. And this goes beyond just being a good man. It's risky, mate. Dangerous." James nodded, acknowledging the truth of Oscar's words. "I know. But I have a contact, a journalist. Her name is Sarah Nolan. She works for a local paper, but she has connections, knows how to get information that's not easily accessible. If anyone can help us find out who's behind this, it's her." Oscar raised an eyebrow. "A journalist. You're trusting the press now." James sighed. "I wouldn't if I had any other choice. But Sarah isn't just any journalist. She used to investigate organized crime rings before she came to Windsor. She knows how to stay under the radar and get answers. I trust her." Oscar nodded, his expression softening slightly. "All right. If you trust her, that's enough for me. Where can we find her?" "She lives on the outskirts of town, near the river," James replied. "We'll head there. With any luck, she'll be home, and she'll agree to help." Oscar turned the car onto a side road, heading toward the quieter, residential part of Windsor. As they drove, James took a deep breath, turning to the back seat where Tamara and Ollie sat in silence, their small bodies leaning into each other, finding comfort in each other's presence. "Are you both okay?" James asked softly, his gaze warm and protective. Tamara nodded, though she looked exhausted. "We're okay, as long as we're with you." She glanced at her brother, who gave a weak but brave smile. "Thank you for not leaving us, James." James's heart ached at her words. He reached back and gave her hand a gentle squeeze. "I promised I'd protect you, and I intend to keep that promise. We're going to figure this out. You're not alone." Ollie nodded, his eyes wide and trusting. "Is the lady we're going to see nice?" James smiled, hoping to ease some of their fears. "Yes, she's nice, and she's very smart. She'll help us figure out what's going on, and she'll know how to keep you safe." As they approached the small house by the river, James felt a knot of tension in his stomach. Sarah Nolan was a good friend, but this was a lot to ask. He was pulling her into a dangerous situation, one that could have consequences beyond anything she'd ever faced. But he had no other options. These children needed answers, and Sarah was the only person who could help him find them. They pulled up outside a modest cottage, nestled among tall trees and surrounded by a neatly kept garden. The lights inside were dim, suggesting that Sarah might be asleep. James felt a pang of guilt for disturbing her at this hour, but he knew there was no time to waste. He turned to Oscar, giving him a grateful nod. "Thanks for getting us here, Oscar. I don't know what I would have done without you." Oscar waved a hand dismissively. "Don't mention it. Just stay safe, mate, and keep those kids close." James nodded, then opened the car door, helping Tamara and Ollie out. He led them up the gravel path to the front door and knocked quietly, hoping Sarah would answer quickly. After a few moments, he heard footsteps approaching, and the door opened to reveal Sarah Nolan, her hair tousled, her eyes bleary with sleep. She blinked in surprise when she saw James standing on her doorstep with two children clinging to his side. "James, what are you doing here?" she asked, her voice thick with confusion. James gave her a tight, apologetic smile. "I'm sorry for showing up like this, Sarah, but I need your help. These kids, they're in danger, and I think you're the only one who can help us find out who's behind it." Sarah's gaze shifted to Tamara and Ollie, her expression softening as she took in their frightened faces. Without hesitation, she stepped aside, gesturing for them to come in. "Come on then. Let's get inside. I'll put on some tea." They entered the cozy warmth of Sarah's home, the scent of herbs and old books filling the air. She led them into the living room, where Tamara and Ollie settled on the couch, looking small and vulnerable against the soft cushions. James sat beside them, keeping a protective arm around their shoulders as Sarah returned with a tray of tea and biscuits. Once they were settled, Sarah sat across from them, her gaze serious and intent as she looked at James. "All right, tell me everything." James took a deep breath, recounting everything that had happened since he had first seen Tamara in the market square. He told her about the mysterious men who had taken their mother, the blood-stained teddy bear, the encounter at the shelter, and the warning from Dr. Whitaker. As he spoke, Sarah listened intently, her expression growing graver with each word. When he finished, she sat back, her brow furrowed in thought. This is serious, James. If these people are connected to organized crime, they won't hesitate to silence anyone who gets in their way, including children. She looked at Tamara and Ollie, her gaze softening. But I'll help. We'll figure out who's behind this, and we'll keep them safe. Tamara leaned forward, her small voice trembling. Do you think our mom is okay? Sarah gave her a reassuring smile. I'm going to do everything I can to find out, sweetheart. I can't promise you anything yet, but I won't stop until we get answers. Tamara nodded, her gaze steady despite the fear in her eyes. She had endured so much, and yet she was holding herself together with a strength that amazed James. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, silently vowing to do whatever it took to protect her and Ollie. Sarah turned back to James. I have a few contacts who owe me favors. I'll start asking around, see if I can dig up any information on who might be targeting them. But we need to be careful. If these people catch wind that we're investigating, they could come after us. James nodded, his expression resolute. I understand. Just tell me what I can do. I'll do whatever it takes. Sarah studied him for a moment, her gaze searching. You're really willing to risk everything for them, aren't you? James didn't hesitate. Yes, they're just children. They deserve a chance at a normal life, a life without fear. Sarah nodded, a look of admiration flickering in her eyes. All right then, let's get to work. She excused herself to make some calls, leaving James alone with Tamara and Ollie. He looked down at them, his heart swelling with a mixture of protectiveness and determination. They were depending on him, and he wasn't about to let them down. A few minutes later, Sarah returned, her face tight with worry. I've reached out to a couple of contacts. One of them, an old friend who works in law enforcement, mentioned that there's been some chatter about a group involved in human trafficking. They've been targeting vulnerable people, mainly women and children. It's possible they took your mother because of something she knew or saw. Tamara's eyes widened, and James felt his heart sink. The thought of their mother being caught up in something so horrifying was almost too much to bear. But he forced himself to stay calm, to keep his focus on the task at hand. Do you think she's still alive? He asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah hesitated, then nodded slowly. It's possible. If she has information they need, they might keep her alive. But we have to move fast. The longer they're on the run, the harder it will be to find her. James clenched his fists, his mind racing as he considered their options. They needed to find a safe place for Tamara and Ollie, somewhere they could stay hidden while he and Sarah searched for answers. But that wasn't enough. They needed more help, more resources if they were going to take on an organized crime group. Sarah, he said, his voice steady, I know this is asking a lot, but can you get us in touch with your law enforcement contact? We need allies in this. People who know how to handle these kinds of situations. Sarah nodded. I'll make the arrangements, but be careful, James. If we're not careful, we could end up putting ourselves and these kids in even more danger. James took a deep breath, his gaze never wavering. I'm willing to take that risk. I'll do whatever it takes to protect them. As the night wore on, Sarah made arrangements for Tamara and Ollie to stay with a trusted friend outside the city, a woman who ran a small, secure shelter for women and children in crisis. It was the safest place for them, far away from Windsor and the people hunting them. The goodbye was difficult, especially for Tamara, who clung to James, tears welling in her eyes. Will you come back for us? James knelt down, meeting her gaze with a fierce intensity. I promise, Tamara. I'll come back for you and Ollie. And I'll find your mom. We'll bring her home. She nodded, wiping her eyes and managing a small, brave smile. I believe you. As he watched them leave with Sarah's friend, James felt a weight settle over him, a mix of fear and resolve. He had made a promise, and he intended to keep it, no matter the cost. Turning to Sarah, he squared his shoulders, his gaze hardening. "Let's go find out who's behind this." Sarah nodded, her eyes filled with determination. Together, they stepped into the night, ready to face whatever shadows lay ahead, ready to fight for the lives of two innocent children caught in a world of danger. The final stand. As dawn approached, a heavy mist settled over the outskirts of Windsor, casting an eerie silence over the landscape. James and Sarah drove in tense silence, their destination looming in the distance, a remote farmhouse that Sarah's contact had identified as a suspected hideout for the criminal group. It was here, according to Sarah's law enforcement source, that a woman matching Tamara and Ollie's mother's description had been spotted just days ago. James clenched his fists, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. After everything Tamara and Ollie had endured, he was prepared to face anything to reunite them with their mother. His thoughts drifted to the children, now safely hidden with Sarah's friend, and he hoped they were resting peacefully, unaware of the battle he was about to face on their behalf. Sarah slowed the car as they approached the farmhouse, pulling off the road and parking behind a dense line of trees. From this distance, they could see the outline of the house, a weathered, sprawling structure with boarded-up windows and an overgrown yard. It looked abandoned, but James knew better. Criminals often used places like this to operate under the radar, hidden from prying eyes and unsuspecting authorities. Sarah killed the engine and turned to James, her expression grim. "This is it. My contact confirmed that a woman fitting their mother's description was last seen here. If she's still alive, this is our best chance to get her back." James nodded, his jaw set with determination. "Then let's do it." They climbed out of the car, moving silently through the trees until they were close enough to observe the farmhouse without being seen. James scanned the area, noting two armed men patrolling the perimeter, their expressions bored and complacent. Clearly, they weren't expecting any trouble. He turned to Sarah, keeping his voice low. "How do you want to handle this?" Sarah's eyes narrowed as she assessed the situation. "We'll need to take out those guards quietly. If we alert anyone inside, they might panic and take it out on her." James nodded, agreeing with her plan. "I'll take the one on the left. You handle the other. Once they're down, we move in." With a quick exchange of glances, they separated, each moving through the shadows toward their target. James approached his guard from behind, his footsteps silent on the damp ground. Years of training had honed his skills, and he moved with the precision of a predator, his focus unwavering. When he was close enough, James lunged forward, wrapping an arm around the guard's neck and pulling him into a tight chokehold. The guard struggled, his hands clawing at James's arm, but James held firm, applying just enough pressure to render the man unconscious without making a sound. He lowered the guard's limp body to the ground, glancing over to see that Sarah had successfully taken down her target as well. They regrouped, their eyes meeting in silent agreement. The guards were down, but the real danger lay inside. As they approached the farmhouse, Sarah took out a set of lockpicks, working quickly to open the back door. Within seconds, she had the door unlocked, and they slipped inside, closing it quietly behind them. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and dust, and the dim interior was cluttered with old furniture and discarded debris. Moving cautiously, they crept down a narrow hallway, their senses on high alert. Voices drifted from a room at the end of the hall, two men speaking in low, hushed tones. James strained to hear, catching snippets of their conversation. "Can't keep her here much longer. Too risky. The boss wants us to move her by tomorrow." "Yeah, well, let's just hope she doesn't cause any more trouble. Last time, she nearly broke my nose." James's heart leaped. The woman they were talking about had to be Tamara and Ollie's mother. He glanced at Sarah, who nodded, her eyes flashing with determination. Without a word, they moved forward, inching closer to the door. James took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. He knew they couldn't afford to hesitate. If they were going to rescue her, They had to act swiftly and decisively. He gestured to Sarah, and together they burst into the room, catching the two men by surprise. Before they could react, James charged forward, tackling the closest man and slamming him against the wall. The man grunted in pain, his face contorted in shock as he struggled against James's grip. Meanwhile, Sarah had drawn her weapon, pointing it at the second man, who froze, his hands raised in surrender. "Don't move," she warned, her voice cold and steady. "We're not here to play games." James tightened his hold on his captive, his voice low and menacing. "Where is she?" "The woman you took. Tell me now, or I promise you'll regret it." The man sneered, his bravado faltering as he met James's fierce gaze. She's in the basement," he stammered, his eyes darting nervously toward his accomplice. "But you'll never make it out of here alive. The boss will." James didn't let him finish. He delivered a swift punch to the man's jaw, rendering him unconscious, then released him, letting his limp body slump to the floor. He turned to Sarah, who kept her gun trained on the other man. "Let's go," he said, his tone urgent. They left the room, leaving the second man tied up, and made their way toward a staircase leading down into the basement. The air grew colder as they descended, the dim light casting eerie shadows on the walls. The faint sound of muffled cries reached their ears, and James quickened his pace, his heart pounding with anticipation. At the bottom of the stairs, they found a heavy wooden door. James tested the handle, finding it locked. Without hesitation, he took a step back and kicked the door open, the force splintering the wood as it swung inward. Inside, a woman sat on the floor, her wrists bound, her face bruised and pale. She looked up as they entered, her eyes widening with a mixture of fear and hope. James recognized her immediately, Tamara and Ollie's mother. She looked exhausted, her clothes torn and dirty, but there was a spark of resilience in her gaze that filled him with admiration. "Mrs. Evans?" James asked gently, stepping forward. She nodded, her voice a whisper. "Yes. Who are you?" "I'm James. Your children, Tamara and Ollie. They're safe. I've been looking after them." Tears filled her eyes, and she choked back a sob, relief flooding her face. They're safe. Oh, thank God." James knelt beside her, pulling out a knife to cut through the ropes binding her wrists. "They're safe. We're going to get you out of here and reunite you with them." Sarah kept watch by the door, her gun at the ready, as James helped Mrs. Evans to her feet. She swayed slightly, her legs weak from days of captivity, but she managed to stand, leaning on him for support. "Come on," he said softly. "Let's go." They made their way back up the stairs, moving as quickly and quietly as possible. But as they reached the top, a figure stepped into their path, blocking their exit. It was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a cold, calculating gaze. The boss. Well, he drawled, his voice dripping with disdain. "I knew you'd cause trouble, Mrs. Evans, but I didn't expect you to bring guests." James stepped protectively in front of Mrs. Evans, his expression hard. "We're leaving. Get out of our way." The boss chuckled, unfazed by the threat in James's voice. "I don't think so. You've interfered in my business, and I can't just let you walk out of here." Sarah aimed her gun at him, her face set with determination. "Back off, or I'll put a bullet in you." The boss raised his hands, feigning surrender, but his gaze remained cold and unyielding. "You don't understand who you're dealing with. You think you can take down an entire organization by yourself. You're just a guard, and she's just a washed-up journalist. You're out of your league." James felt a surge of anger, but he kept his voice steady. "Maybe we are, but I'm not leaving without her." The boss smirked, his eyes glinting with malice. "Then I guess this is where it ends for you." In a swift, unexpected move, he lunged forward, reaching for the gun tucked into his belt. But before he could draw it, Sarah fired, the shot ringing out in the confined space. The bullet struck the boss in the shoulder, and he stumbled back, cursing in pain. James took advantage of the momentary distraction, grabbing Mrs. Evans's hand and pulling her toward the exit. "Go," he shouted to Sarah, who nodded and followed, covering their retreat as they sprinted out of the farmhouse and into the open air. They ran toward the car, adrenaline fueling their movements as they heard shouts and footsteps behind them. James helped Mrs. Evans into the back seat, then climbed in beside her, while Sarah slid into the driver's seat, starting the engine with a roar. As they sped away from the farmhouse, James glanced back, watching as the figures of the boss and his men faded into the distance. Relief washed over him, mingled with the lingering tension.